So today I'm going to be talking about how Canadian banks are propping up Toronto's crumbling new condo market and how Trump's tariffs completely changed the world. My name is John Pasalis. My team and I help buyers and sellers throughout the Toronto area make smarter real estate decisions. If you'd like to meet with me and my team, just click the link in the show notes below or shoot me an email at askjohn@movesmartly.com. So, going to kick off talking about an important issue. One I actually recorded a video on this channel back in June on Toronto's new condo market. And the question back then was, are Canadian banks propping up our new condo market? What I had talked about was that many of the condos that were completing in 2024, and the same issue is going to happen in 2025, are not worth what the buyers paid for them. And that's because when they bought them in 2019 or 2020, they paid 30 to 40% above current resale prices at that time, expecting the condo market to keep appreciating in value. But prices have actually been relatively flat for 4 years in Toronto. So by the time these units are completing, they're not worth what they paid for them. So imagine you paid $1 million for a condominium downtown, pre-construction back in 2019 or 2020. Fast forward to today, you're about to get your keys, and the bank says, well, it's only worth $800,000. Well, typically, when you buy a property that has declined in value, the banks will tell you you need to come up with an additional down payment, because let's just say I originally put down 200 grand, 20% of the original purchase price. Well, that's gone. The decline in value is basically my original deposit. Now the unit's worth 800. I have no skin in the game because it's declined in value. The bank would say you got to put up an extra 20% or $160,000 now on the new appraised value. But banks were doing last year, what we found, again, anecdotally, these were just stories, is hard to prove. It was just like an open secret in the industry. The banks were saying, you know what, don't worry about what it's worth. We're just going to pretend the unit's worth what you paid for it. So you don't need to come up with any extra money on the table. They're basically giving you an $800,000 mortgage on a unit that's only worth $800,000. So basically zero down. And banks were doing this because people couldn't come up with the extra money, and they didn't want the condo project to fail because they were financing it. That would lead to even bigger problems. So it was basically a way of banks kind of conspiring to keep condo prices as high as possible, because obviously this goes against banking regulations, but somehow the banking regulations don't really apply to them in these certain situations. So now, when I recorded this video back in June, and I'll share a link to it in the show notes below, I left it a question: are banks doing this? Again, because it's hard to prove. We don't have access to the bank's data. You can't look at it by looking at land registry data. It's very hard to prove. But again, we all knew it was happening. I mean, people in the real estate industry, myself, Steve Saretsky, Ron Butler, Jordan Skrinko, Daniel Foch, so many people were kind of talking about this. We all knew this was happening, couldn't prove it. So it wasn't really in the mainstream media. No one was talking about it outside of, channels like this or on Twitter, until the weekend. A Globe and Mail article came out over the weekend that talked about this specific issue. They gave an example of a buyer who paid $2.2 million for a pre-construction condo in Leaside. When it came time for him to get a mortgage, the bank basically said, well, it's only worth $1.6 million, a $600,000 gap. He did not have enough money to cover what would be needed to basically close on the property. But he shared kind of documents, communications between the builder and himself, showing that the Royal Bank promised that they would just turn a blind eye. They would pretend this unit that is now only worth 1.6 million is really actually, they're going to pretend it's worth what they paid for, 2.2, so he doesn't need to come up with an extra capital. So this is a 27% decline. Potentially, this person's getting a $1.7 million mortgage on a condo that's only worth 1.6. So unbelievable to see banks basically pretending condos are worth 27% more than they really are to prevent buyers from defaulting on their units, which is what normally would happen. And again, when I did this video, one of my points is that people should be pissed off because listen, it's not that I want, these buyers to default, but at the end of the day, you make an investment, you pay the price for your losses. Like you should not have banks and our government bailing you out of your crappy real estate decisions. I made a crappy real estate decision. It's on me. But the way the Canadian government's approaching this is they're basically trying to bail people out of their shitty real estate decisions by giving them these blanket appraisals. And this is where when we talk about the housing market, you have a lot of free market advocates. They want housing to be a free market. Housing's not a free market. It is a very rigged market. And it is rigged, of course, to keep home prices elevated. And this is, I think, obviously the biggest sign of that. So, this news over the weekend, I think, was quite important for two reasons. I mean, number one, it's the first time we've actually seen a bank admit that they're going to these lengths. They're willing to pretend a unit is worth 27% more than what it actually is in order to give that person a mortgage so they can qualify to buy the property. It's unbelievable to see that. So again, this is the first time we're seeing banks actually admits to this. But secondly, this is going to be a problem. I kind of talked about this on previous episodes. It's going to be an even bigger problem in 2025 than it was in 2024 because the gap between what people paid and what units are worth is growing. Last year's between 10 to 20%. This year it's going to be 20 to 30 or plus. Like this particular unit is 27%. So how long will banks keep doing this, especially in an environment where condo prices aren't going up anytime soon? Ben Rabideau, who's a housing analyst and who we've had on the show before, asked a very important question. Will these mortgages, especially the ones that are under 1.5 million, will banks be putting them under what's called a portfolio insurance, so effectively insuring them through CMHC after the fact to put them under their mortgage-backed securities program to get them off their books, effectively potentially having taxpayers backstop these crappy mortgages, getting them off the bank's books, and we're paying the price for it. And we don't know yet. Again, there's no answers. There's very little clarity, but it's very possible this is one of the reasons that the federal government increased the limit on insured mortgages to 1.5 million to allow the banks to dump these crappy mortgages off of their books, insure them by the government. Taxpayers are covering them. So when they default on their mortgage, we're paying the bill basically for these investors' crappy decisions that the banks decided to give them a mortgage on. So anyhow, I think it's an important issue. We're going to see how far banks will go, how far our government will go, and what obviously insights we get regarding whether or not these mortgages are in fact going to be insured by CMHC. I suspect they probably will be. They're going to try to keep it below the radar and not really disclose it. But I think it makes sense for when we think about why our federal government increased the limit on insured mortgages. I think part of this was a bailout of the big banks, so the banks are not on the hook for dumping all of these garbage mortgages on the market. We as the taxpayers are effectively going to potentially pay that bill. So I think it's an important space to keep an eye on, and one, of course, I'm going to be chatting about in the months ahead as we see how this story plays out. So the next thing I wanted to chat about is, I think, an important issue. I mean, obviously, we've heard the news about the tariffs, how they're impacting the market. We've had a 30-day hold on them, but I don't think everyone appreciates how big of a deal this is. And the other week, there's a great article in the Financial Times by Martin Wolf, who basically said that the 25% tariffs on Canada and Mexico and the 10% tariffs on China change the world. And it sounds dramatic, but he's 100% correct. And it makes no difference that the tariffs are on hold. And it changes the world for a number of reasons. I mean, for starters, when we think about Trump's approach to trade, I mean, his whole approach to foreign policy and trade is a complete shift from what we've seen over the past 34 years. Trump has a very narrow focus on how bilateral trade should work. So if a country like Canada has a trade surplus over the US, we're ripping the Americans off, according to his narrative, which is a very odd narrative because Canada actually has a trade deficit with the US if you exclude oil and gas. Once you include oil and gas, yes, we have a surplus because the US imports so much oil and gas for Canada. This is what they really need. So if his concern was this surplus that Canada has, you would think he would tax oil and gas higher, but he didn't. He only taxed it by 10% rather than 25%, or at least proposed a 10% tariff rather than 25. And again, he did this because it's such an important part of their economy. If he put a 25% tariff on Canadian oil and gas to bring the trade back to balance, it actually would have driven up gas prices probably in the US, which would be very politically unpopular. So his approach to trade policy is kind of irrational. So it's very hard to navigate when what the other party is saying doesn't make sense. Of course, he has this obsession with fentanyl in Canada and it being, imported, or basically cross the border from Canada to the U.S. And like, it's interesting. I've seen a ton of Canadian pundits and commentators kind of take up this sort of team Trump propaganda that we're this massive source of fentanyl in Canada crossing the border. And sure, we have an issue, especially in BC and in Ontario. But is Canada this major source of fentanyl crossing the border? The data looks like it is not. Certainly not anything close to what is coming from Mexico. And yet, again, we have this irrational narrative. Of course, his approach to annex Canada or hinting, Trudeau came out last week talking about, I think it's supposed to be off record, that he actually believes Trump is serious about taking over Canada. This, of course, goes against everything NATO stands for. NATO is an ally of countries, a union, an alliance of countries on the same side. It's a defensive alliance. So to have the US arguing that they're going to take off or hinting they're going to annex Canada, again, changes foreign policy completely. And, the biggest victim, and Wolf talked about this in his article, in these tariffs and his approach to policy is predictability. Countries, businesses, households like things to be predictable. Businesses do not want to invest in their business when they're worried that their biggest trading partner could just slap a tariff on their imports tomorrow, because that's obviously going to impact their business. Households are more reluctant to buy another home, to move up, to get a new job when they're worried about their job security, when they're worried that they might lose their job if our neighbor south of the border slaps on a new tariff and it impacts our economy. So predictability is going to be the biggest victim. And I agree with Martin Wolf's article, and it's going to weigh on the economy and households in the months and years ahead. It's going to be hard to make long-term decisions when you don't know what Trump's going to do next or how far he'll go. And I think that's going to be the bigger challenge that's going to weigh on our economy in the months ahead. It's in the years ahead. It's all of this uncertainty, which will not go away in 30 days. It's probably going to be there for quite some time. And it's going to have quite a bit of an impact, I'd say, on our market and economy as we move forward. I hope you found that helpful. If you have any questions or comments, please post them in the notes below or shoot me an email at askjohn@movesmartly.com.